listener production.
Hi, Helen Smith here with you. Welcome to The Briefing. There are over 1.1 million registered firearms in Australia as gun ownership is on the rise. But it's not as clear-cut as it may seem.
Despite the increase in the number of firearms in New South Wales, and there's probably somewhere between 3 and 3.5 million firearms in Australia more broadly, it is fewer people who are owning those firearms.
And registered guns are only part of the problem, with experts across the country calling for a national register to help combat illegal firearms and the rise of the sovereign citizen movement challenging Australia's gun control. That's coming up in the second half of this episode. First though, let's get into the headlines with Chris Spiru. It's Monday, the 1st of September.
Hey Helen, and to you listening, it is very good to be back. Anti-mass immigration rallies held across the country yesterday have been condemned by a number of groups who this morning have labelled them hateful, racist and divisive. Tens of thousands of people joined March for Australia protests across a number of major cities, including Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Brisbane and Canberra, pushing back against what they say is an unsustainable level of migration.
It's okay to criticise the government's invasive immigration policies. It's okay to want to be around people who look like you and talk like you. It's okay to stand up for your people and fly your flag. It's okay to want your kids to grow up in a society where they're not minorities in their classrooms. It's okay to not want to compete against foreigners just to get into the rental market or the workforce.
Among those joining the marches were One Nation leader Pauline Hanson, federal MP Bob Katter, as well as a number of members of neo-Nazi group, the National Socialist Network, who violently clashed with some protesters, including those from pro-Palestine and anti-fascist groups in Melbourne. Victoria Police say 6 people were arrested and are facing assault charges, while in Brisbane, 1 man was arrested, a woman in Sydney and at least 3 others in Adelaide.
The Australian Council of Social Services and the Federation of Ethnic Communities as Councils of Australia have since spoken out against the rallies, describing Australia's diversity as a great strength, not a threat. Now, Helen, this kind of was unfolding right as I got back into the country, not really the welcome I was expecting, but I do want to say this, as I was flicking through a bunch of the live streams of the event, there seems to be a bit of a disconnect between the official speeches that we heard and the people that were interviewed on the ground. Now, those people who were interviewed by a bunch of journalists and independent creators, they were talking a lot about the cost of living, you know, the price of a bag of groceries, the fact that you're walking out of Coles and Woolies now, like, paying $300 and you're walking out with 2 bags of groceries. Like, things are not looking good. And there was a big theme and there was a big focus on government corruption, Aussie assets and resources being sold to foreign entities. Like, all of these are very much real and legitimate problems. But, you know, for me, all that messaging kind of gets lost when you hear what we've just heard.
Yeah, and it points to those real issues of the cost of living being an issue of immigration and migration, which we know is not the case. Cost of living is important, but these theories of immigration being the cause of all of these problems was actually a key issue at this year's election, with the coalition linking it to the housing crisis in particular, with Peter Dutton saying Labor was to blame for bringing in, quote, 1 million people over 2 years, and that has created the housing crisis. But the housing crisis hasn't just appeared in the last 2 years. It's been getting worse for more than 2 decades, and many experts within the housing sector have came out against these ideas, saying the problem of housing affordability is due to a lack of supply from the public sector of low-cost housing and rental properties mixed with tax breaks for investors. Yes, we have a housing crisis issue, but it is not entirely caused by immigration. So I think, yes, while some of the messages were important, we are facing these challenges, this is not a chance to target minorities.
The wife of alleged sovereign citizen gunman Dezi Freeman broke her silence for the first time over the weekend, urging him to surrender while also offering her condolences to the families of the 2 police officers who were shot dead. It's been almost a week since Freeman was last seen since the fatal shootings of officers Neil Thompson and Vadim Devad.
In a statement from her lawyers, Freeman's wife, Amalia, says her and her children respect the important work of Victoria Police and do not hold anti-authority views. She went on to urge her husband to call 000 and arrange a surrender plan with the police and for anyone who might be assisting him to contact police. It comes as a man is being investigated in connection to the search for Freeman, with authorities charging him with weapons and drug offences in Victoria.
Steve Mallett, who was charged last week, is part of an ongoing investigation, according to police, who are looking at any links between him and Freeman. However, he has told media he's never met the alleged gunman. As the search continues, more than 450 police officers have been deployed into the rural community across Victoria, searching through dense bushland, caves, old mines and dugouts.
Overseas now, where Greta Thunberg is once again sailing towards Gaza. The Swedish activist is among those on board one of 20 ships sailing towards the region, aiming to break the Israeli blockade and bring in humanitarian aid, food, water and medicine.
The question here today is not why we are sailing. This story is not at all about the mission that we are about to embark. The story here is about Palestine. The story here is how people are being deliberately deprived of the very basic means to survive.
The 21-year-old is sailing alongside Game of Thrones actor Liam Cunningham and Thelma and Louise star Susan Sarandon, as well as a number of activists, politicians and journalists. They are set to be joined by more ships from ports in Greece, Italy and Tunisia in the coming days.
It's the second time the activist has attempted the journey, the first being in June when she was detained and deported by the Israeli military. And her attempt comes as hundreds of Palestinians are again fleeing the city of Gaza for the south as Israel enters its initial stages of its widely condemned plan to occupy the city.
Back home now, house prices have officially risen again. August saw national home values rise by 0.7%, making it the 7th consecutive monthly increase and the biggest gain since May last year. According to researchers behind the report at Cotality, the drivers of rising home values are straightforward and they include lower interest rates, rising real wages and a shortage of homes for sale mixed with buyer optimism.
The national median home value is now nearly $850,000, up 4.1% over the year, while the growing demand for houses is outpacing supply, listings down 20% compared to the average for this time last year. And it comes as just last week, the federal government announced the fast-tracking of its first home buyers guarantee scheme to start in October and changed pricing and income caps, making it more accessible to more Aussies, which economists warn will likely add to our supply and demand issues.
Yeah, and I know, Helen, you're waiting to hear which city is the most expensive, and in a shock to absolutely no one, it is our home city, Sydney, with a median value sitting around $1.2 million, while Darwin recorded the largest annual gain of 10.2% and a median value of just over $550,000. Meanwhile, our national rents also recorded their highest growth since May last year, woohoo, with an increase of 0.5%, taking annual growth to 4.1%, with rental vacancies still near record lows.
And an end of an era for one Aussie state as a world-first ban on fish-shaped soy sauce kicks in today. The plastic fish will no longer be available for sushi lovers in South Australia as part of a wider ban on single-use plastics.
But fear not, Helen Smith, large soy sauce bottles and sachets will still be kicking around, as will large plastic containers that can hold more than 30 ml of the sauce. Currently, the fishies hold around 2.5 to 3 ml. And look, Helen, this made international news while I was overseas. Australia became a little bit of the laughing stock among my cousins and families as we were sitting at a cafe sipping on plastic straws, and they said, what, Chris, is going on in your country? Helen Smith, please enlighten us.
Tut, tut, tut. No plastic straws here. No, while this may seem like quite a trivial kind of issue, It does point to a larger issue of, the environment and global warming and climate crisis that we are facing. But taking it back a little bit, this fish-shaped device was actually invented in 1954, and it was first made of glass or ceramics before it became to the plastic fishies we know today. And although the soy sauce containers are made of a recyclable plastic, because they're so small, they struggle to be processed by machines properly, meaning that they often don't actually get recycled.
Yeah, and look, this is obviously part of a, larger, broader movement towards banning single-use plastics. We know in SA legislation passed in 2023, and that was all to do with those, supermarket bags, which a lot of people were not happy about, plastic straws, drink stirrers, etc., etc. Look, it's a step forward. It's niching down. It's very interesting to now find out what little parts that we, take for granted or that we use day to day that might be on the chopping block. So watch this space, briefers. Anyway, that is it for our headlines for today. Coming up next is your deep dive, Helen Smith, on our rising gun ownership here in Australia. Have a listen. That is coming up for you next.
Deadly double shooting outside an inner west pub.
56-year-old local who was heavily armed.
Gun owners taking their anger straight to the source.
A sudden and savage shooting.
Police received reports of shots fired at a home in Ambervale.
Tonight, the gunman is still on the run.
Australia's rising gun ownership is in the national spotlight after alleged gunman and sovereign citizen Dezi Freeman shot and killed 2 police officers in Victoria last week. And despite fewer licensed gun owners, the number of firearms in Australia is greater than it was before the Port Arthur massacre, raising concerns about regulation and transparency across the country. The right to hunt has also been brought to the table by the New South Wales Shooters Reform Bill, prompting discussions around our gun laws here in Australia and if they're still fit for purpose. Joel Negin is a professor of public health at the University of Sydney. Joel, gun ownership is on the rise here in Australia, even though fewer people are getting licences. What's going on here?
Well, that's exactly right. In New South Wales alone, there are 1.1 million registered firearms. And those are registered firearms. Those don't include illegal firearms that are not registered or not linked to a licensed firearm holder. Yet, at the same time, despite the increase in the number of firearms in New South Wales, and there's probably somewhere between 3 and 3.5 million firearms in Australia more broadly, it is fewer people who are owning those firearms. So those who own firearms are owning more. And in New South Wales, 97% of the population do not own firearms.
So as you mentioned there, we have millions of registered guns in Australia, and it's more than before Port Arthur. Does that surprise you? Should we be concerned about those numbers?
I come at this from a public health lens and from a public safety lens, and all the legislation in Australia related to firearms emphasizes public safety and community values. There's no right to bear arms. There's no right to have a firearm as there is in the US. So in the Australian context, public safety and community values and community safety has to come first. So in general, having more firearms in the community carries with it a risk. In the same way, from a public health perspective, if you had lots of alcohol venues or lots of venues selling cigarettes or vapes, the more firearms we have, that has a risk to public safety. So it's not necessarily saying that these registered firearms and these license holders are bad people, but the more guns there are in the community, the more risk there is. And a lot of the emphasis is on mass shootings and assaults and murders. And obviously we have this situation that's ongoing in Victoria right now. But the majority of firearm deaths and injuries are actually suicides and accidents. And a lot of those are occurring among licensed firearm holders using registered weapons.
Now, registered guns are only part of the picture. How many unregistered guns do you estimate are held in Australia? Because we also have 3D printers and technology emerging that's contributing to that.
The truth is we don't know. And I'm really reluctant to hazard a guess. The other thing we don't know, which is a frustration for everyone involved in firearm safety and gun clubs and the gun lobby, is that we actually don't know what percentage of firearm crimes are committed with registered firearms or by licensed holders. So we don't know if we hear about an assault somewhere in Sydney, whether that assault was conducted by a licensed firearm holder using a registered weapon or if it was an illegal weapon. And not having that information really impedes our ability to address the public safety and policing aspect of it. It's a significant gap in our knowledge.
Former Prime Minister John Howard's Port Arthur gun reforms have been described as one of the best decisions the government has ever made and are considered one of his most important legacies as a leader. Do you think today's leaders are still holding the line on gun control?
It is absolutely slipping back. I think we as a community have done a lot of self-congratulating on the firearm legislation, the National Firearms Agreement that came out of Port Arthur. And it has had a very significant impact on reducing firearm violence in Australia, and it's seen the world over as a success story. But the courage and vigilance that emerged after Port Arthur is certainly slipping. And as you noted, there are more firearms in Australia than there were at the time of Port Arthur. There are a lot of efforts by certain political parties to weaken gun legislation. So there is a real risk that our policy settings might slip back. There's been the introduction of a new bill in New South Wales, the Game and Feral Animal Legislation Amendment, which is trying to essentially create a right to hunt, allow the use of silencers, establish kind of a new authority, a new kind of governing model that has the potential to dramatically weaken the gun control success that Australia has had. So it is a slippery environment right now, and that requires vigilance by the Australian community.
Speaking of the New South Wales Shooters Reform Bill, what's your take on the idea of a right to hunt?
Yeah, as noted before, all the legislation in Australia emphasizes public safety first and foremost. There is no right to bear arms. There's no right to have a firearm. The right to hunt as a concept is one thing, but of course, if the hunting is done with firearms, there's no right to have a firearm to do that hunting. So this is a bill that came about without a lot of proper stakeholder engagement, did not involve New South Wales Health or community groups or rural doctors or public health professionals or any of the groups who should have say in this. There's been a long effort to, for example, introduce the use of silencers by the gun lobby in New South Wales, and it's kind of snuck into this bill under the guise of hunting and the guise of protecting the hearing of shooters, and that is not the way policy of this type that has such an impact on community safety should be designed, nor should it pass in its current form.
When people think of gun ownership, they can often think of it as a rural thing, but a third of New South Wales guns are actually in metro areas, including Sydney, and then in Melbourne and Brisbane, we have kind of the same patterns emerging. What does that say about how our gun culture is changing?
Yeah, there's a narrative that we all hold that it's about farmers culling animals, and certainly I want to emphasize there are licensed holders who have guns for legitimate reasons. It is legal to have a firearm in Australia. In the same way that I'm not looking to ban alcohol or gambling or smoking for that matter, but it's a matter of putting public health and public safety first. So when we see that there are increases in the number of firearms, are we sure that our policy settings are sufficient to keep the community safe? And that's about making sure we have a national firearm registry, making sure police have access to the right information, making sure that when guns are being sold, they're being sold to people who are fit and appropriate to hold a firearm license. So the questions of who should own a firearm and are we putting public safety first are paramount in this environment. Whether it's urban or rural, I think those policy settings have to hold, and that's where we're working with New South Wales Police to try and ensure that the policy settings are appropriate.
It does seem like across the board, most Australians say they do want tougher gun laws and to keep our community safe and protected. Yet gun numbers keep climbing. Where do you think this disconnect is?
Well, there are shooting clubs, there are gun clubs who have increasing membership. They actually have quite a lot of funding, and so they are actively creating a kind of political group in Australia, and you mentioned the Shooters Party. There's also members of the Federal National Party who are linked in with and supported by people with these perspectives. It's a powerful group right now with increasing political power and increasing political clout. And so New South Wales population, that 90% plus of people who want stricter firearm laws, need to make sure that their voice is heard when they're speaking to their politicians. Just like any group that has a very firm view and they're very noisy and emphatic, we need to make sure that the silent majority are not so silent.
Now, looking across Australia, should we be pushing for harder national standards?
Well, I think one of the challenges in Australia, and this is not just in the firearms policy space, it's just the fact that we have these 9 jurisdictions who all do things somewhat differently. So one of the big efforts right now that the Commonwealth Government has been emphasizing is a national firearms registry. So right now, each state, each territory has its own firearm registry. And those are held in different types of databases. The one in Tasmania, as far as I understand, is paper-based. So it's different databases, different styles, different ways of collecting information, even different ways of classifying firearms. And so when you do have cross-border movement, which of course in Australia is very common, the ability of community safety organizations or police forces to actually share that information in real time is not doable. So a National Firearms Registry, which is an effort right now, is to ensure that the data that's collected, some of the standards, some of the classifications are more unified. And that helps the police do its job and helps us adhere to the community safety principle that governs firearm policy in this country.
Joel, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thank you very much.
That was Joel Negin from the University of Sydney. And thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. Before you go, though, we'd love it if you could share this episode with someone else you think might enjoy it. It's a really easy way you can support everything we do here at The Briefing. And you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. I'm Helen Smith. Catch you next time.